They caught her between two empires, one that called her ally and one that called her rebel. But before either could decide what she truly was, she had already built her own. Zenobia of Palmyra, queen, mother, and the woman who dared to call herself equal to Rome. Her story began not in conquest, but in loss. When her husband, Odaenathus, was murdered, she stood before her people, widowed, surrounded by rivals, and refused to step aside. She didn't shout or demand vengeance. She simply said, "Palmyra will stand." Palmyra was no ordinary city. It lay in the desert between Persia and Rome, a crossroads where caravans met and cultures mixed. Its wealth came from movement, from the spices, silk, and gold that passed through its gates. To survive there, a ruler needed both strength and restraint. Zenobia had learned both long before she wore a crown. She was born into a noble house, educated in Greek, Aramaic, and Latin. She studied history, philosophy, and Roman law. People later said she could debate a scholar as easily as command a general. For her, knowledge was armor, the kind that couldn't be taken. When she married Odaenathus, Palmyra was powerful but fragile. The Roman world was cracking. Emperor Valerian had been captured by the Persians, and the eastern provinces were slipping away. Odaenathus fought to restore them. He struck back against Persia, drove them east, and became both Rome's defender and Palmyra's king. Zenobia watched and learned. He ruled by the sword. She ruled by patience. Together they balanced loyalty to Rome with independence in practice. Then, without warning, he was gone, killed while returning from campaign. Some said by jealous nobles, others by his own kin. No one knows for sure. What history remembers is what followed. Zenobia stepped into the silence. Her son, Odaenathus, was a child, and the city waited for Rome to appoint a new protector. Instead, Zenobia declared herself regent. The Romans hesitated, then accepted. They needed stability more than questions. She wore black for mourning, gold for command, and calm for survival. Then she began to rebuild what death had broken. She trained her army, secured the trade routes, and filled the treasury. Every move was measured, deliberate, precise. People said she never raised her voice, yet every order was obeyed. Her generals respected her discipline. Her scholars admired her mind. Even her enemies admitted she ruled as if born to it. At night, she walked the walls of Palmyra, looking east toward Persia and west toward Rome. Two empires stronger than hers, both expecting her to bend. But the desert teaches endurance. She had buried a husband, inherited a fragile kingdom, and kept it alive between storms. And somewhere in that quiet, the idea began to form. If the world was ruled by empires that claimed eternity, perhaps it was time to build one of her own. Ruling wasn't new to Palmyra. Ruling well, balancing strength and restraint, was. Zenobia didn't try to fill her husband's shadow. She built her own. Her palace became a place of both order and thought. She gathered generals, merchants, and philosophers, not flatterers, but minds. Among them was Cassius Longinus, a Greek scholar once celebrated in Athens. He had searched for a ruler who valued wisdom as much as conquest. He found her. Under Zenobia, Palmyra changed. The soldiers stayed sharp, but the markets thrived. Tax laws were rewritten. Trade routes reopened. The city's language began to sound like all the worlds she connected: Greek, Aramaic, Arabic. It was becoming a meeting point not just of caravans, but of cultures. She read reports herself, cross-examined merchants, and personally settled disputes when governors failed. For a desert queen, she ruled like a statesman. Visitors wrote that she could speak about Plato and politics, poetry and logistics with equal ease. Her court lived by her two virtues, intellect and discipline. She refused to rule from behind curtains. When drought struck, she appeared in the streets with her son, handing out grain with her own hands. It wasn't theater, it was example. Rome noticed. At first, they admired her. A stable Palmyra meant a secure frontier, but admiration turned to suspicion. Her coins began to show her son beside the Roman emperor, a gesture that looked like loyalty, yet hinted at equality. And equality was something Rome never tolerated for long. Still, Zenobia remained careful. She sent tribute, signed her letters in Latin, and addressed the emperor formally. But behind her calm words, she was preparing for more. She reorganized her army, promoted local commanders, and strengthened alliances with Arab tribes. To Rome, these looked like defensive measures. To her, they were the groundwork of independence. Cassius Longinus once told her that every empire begins with an idea. She answered, then Palmyra must think for itself. She knew the risk. Rome had crushed kings for less. But Zenobia didn't see rebellion. She saw survival. Rome was stretched thin, fighting in the west and losing loyalty in the east. If Palmyra didn't guard itself now, it wouldn't last. To her, independence wasn't defiance, it was protection. But ambition and survival never stay equal for long. History doesn't mark the moment she crossed the line. Power rarely comes from one choice. It grows from 1,000 quiet ones, steady, necessary, and dangerous. And in those quiet nights in Palmyra, Zenobia was already walking the line between guardian and ruler. Every empire begins, not with banners or declarations, but with choices that feel harmless at the time. For Zenobia, it began with Egypt. In 269 CE, reports came that the province was in chaos. Rome's grip had weakened. Its governors quarreled among themselves. Egypt wasn't just another territory. It was the empire's breadbasket, the source of grain that fed Rome itself. If order broke there, the East would starve. Zenobia sent her general Zabdas to restore control. Officially, it was an act of loyalty, securing Rome's supply lines. But the soldiers who marched carried Palmyra's banners, not Rome's. The campaign succeeded. Zabdas entered Alexandria, defeated the Roman forces, and declared the province secure under Zenobia's regency. For the first time, her orders reached beyond Syria. From Egypt, her influence spread. Neighboring regions, parts of Anatolia and Arabia, fell in line, some by treaty, others by quiet pressure. Trade revived, armies obeyed, Palmyra's merchants grew richer than ever. It was easy to see this as protection, but the truth was simpler. Zenobia was building a new order. She didn't crown herself empress or announce rebellion. Instead, she began using a title reserved for imperial blood, Augusta. Her son, Odaenathus, was named Augustus on local coinage. In the language of power, that was no longer loyalty. That was equality. Rome could not ignore it. The new Emperor Aurelian had already begun restoring the fractured empire. When Zenobia's coins reached his hands, he saw not partnership, but defiance. He wrote to her, calm but firm, reminding her that the East belonged to Rome. Her reply, if she sent one, did not survive. But her next act did. She minted more coins in both their names. To her people, it meant shared rule. To Aurelian, it was open challenge. At home, her confidence grew. She rode among her soldiers dressed in armor, not jewels. Ancient writers claimed she led campaigns on horseback, marched beside her troops, and endured hardship without complaint. Whether every detail was true or not, her men believed she would never ask what she wouldn't do herself. Trade caravans carried her story from Egypt to Persia, of a queen who ruled like a general and thought like a scholar. In Rome's streets, her name became a warning, the Eastern Queen. But power that rises quickly casts long shadows. Her advisors began to argue. Some urged diplomacy, others full independence. Cassius Longinus counseled caution, warning that Rome never forgets. Zenobia listened, but her course was already set. She had crossed the point where retreat would look like weakness, and perhaps she believed that intellect and discipline could match empire and legend. For a while, she was right. Palmyra's reach spread wider than ever before. Trade flourished. Soldiers swore loyalty. From the Nile to the Euphrates, her rule brought stability where Rome had brought only taxes and war. She had done what no one thought possible, built an empire from the desert. But every empire creates its reflection, a rival strong enough to test it. And across the Mediterranean, Aurelian was gathering his legions. He would not write again. His next message would come on the march. By the time Aurelian turned his eyes east, Rome had been fractured for years. He had already crushed rebellions in the west and reclaimed lost provinces. Now only one rival remained, the queen who ruled from the desert and dared to print her name beside his. To Rome, Zenobia was no longer a queen, she was an enemy. Aurelian knew that to rebuild the empire, he had to bring her down himself. In 272 CE, he gathered his armies and began the long march towards Syria. Zenobia prepared as well. She strengthened her walls, called her generals, and rallied the cities that had joined her cause. Palmyra's soldiers were fierce and disciplined, loyal to her not by title, but by trust. They were fighting for more than borders. They were fighting for the right to exist without Rome's shadow. The first clash came near Antioch at a place called Emei. Her general Zabdas commanded the field. Aurelian's legions advanced in heavy armor. The Palmyrines fought fast and light. At first, Rome faltered. Aurelian's cavalry appeared to retreat, fleeing toward the heat-blurred plains. Zabdas pressed the attack, believing victory close, but it was a trap. Aurelian's retreat was a feint. His cavalry wheeled suddenly, charging back through the dust and cutting into the Palmyrine flank. The desert swallowed sound, and then came silence. Emei was lost. Zenobia withdrew her forces to Emesa, modern Homs, and tried again to hold the line. She knew the terrain. The city was loyal, but Aurelian's legions were relentless, soldiers hardened by years of civil war. By the end of the battle, Palmyra's line broke again. The dream of a desert empire began to crumble. She retreated to Palmyra, the city that had believed it could survive anything. Its walls were high, its gates strong, and the desert itself guarded the approach. Aurelian surrounded the city and offered surrender. Zenobia refused. Inside, confidence turned to endurance. Food ran short. Messages from allied cities stopped coming. One by one, those who had sworn loyalty returned to Rome. Still, she held firm, not because she thought she could win, but because yielding would erase everything she had built. Cassius Longinus urged negotiation. Others begged her to flee before it was too late. She listened, silent for a long moment, and finally said a queen should never abandon her city while there was still a chance to save it. Then, when that chance vanished, she rode east, not to run, but to seek help. She hoped the Sasanian king would grant her refuge. Her escort was small, the journey desperate. But near the Euphrates, Roman scouts caught her. When the soldiers brought her to Aurelian, she was dust-covered, exhausted, yet calm. He asked why she had defied Rome. Zenobia said she ruled for her people, that Rome had grown weak, and that the East deserved its own strength. Even in chains, she defended her choice. Witnesses said Aurelian hesitated before speaking again. He admired courage, even in an enemy, and Zenobia had nothing left to lose but dignity, the one thing she refused to surrender. History remembers victories in bronze. It remembers endurance in silence. When word spread that the queen had been taken, Palmyra changed overnight. The guards on the walls stopped looking toward the horizon. Merchants closed their stalls. People waited, unsure whether Rome would destroy them or forgive. Inside the city, her generals tried to hold command, but the will to fight had gone. Every man and woman knew their queen had not fallen in battle. She had been captured on the road, reaching for one last chance. That truth carried more weight than defeat itself. Aurelian's army entered soon after. There was no slaughter, no burning of temples. He had seen enough of war to understand the cost of pride. He treated the city firmly, but spared it. He knew that destroying Palmyra would make Zenobia a legend. Sparing it would make her a story. Her advisor, Cassius Longinus, was not as lucky. Captured with her, he was executed soon after. Some said he claimed full responsibility to protect her. Others believed Aurelian wanted to make an example of the mind behind the rebellion. Either way, the philosopher died for the queen he believed in. Zenobia was taken west under guard. Through the lands she had once ruled, she passed cities that had flown her banner, now flying Rome's again. No one cheered, but no one resisted. They simply watched, remembering what it had felt like when, for a moment, the East had stood under its own rule. In Rome, Aurelian prepared his triumph, a grand procession meant to prove that unity had been restored. When Zenobia appeared, she wore chains of gold so heavy that attendants had to help her walk. The crowd expected humiliation. Instead, they saw poise. Tired, yes, but unbowed. After that, the record divides. Roman accounts say Aurelian spared her, granting her a villa near Tivoli, where she lived comfortably, more guest than prisoner. Eastern stories say she refused to live in defeat and took her own life before the parade ended. No one knows which is true, but both versions agree on one thing. She met her fate on her own terms. Palmyra never recovered its old strength. Trade slowed, the walls decayed. The desert began to reclaim what the city had built. A brief rebellion followed, but Aurelian returned and crushed it for good. The empire swallowed Palmyra. The desert fell silent again. And yet, something of her remained, not in monuments, but in memory. She had stood between two worlds, too proud to be ruled, too disciplined to be forgotten. In her defeat, people saw not failure, but proof of how far courage can go before the world pushes back. They brought her to Rome as a warning, but she arrived as a reminder. No one could agree on what they saw, a rebel, a queen, or a woman who had tested the limits of empire. For Aurelian, it was victory. For Zenobia, it was the last duty of a ruler, to face judgment with dignity. On the day of the triumph, crowds filled the streets before dawn. Romans pressed shoulder to shoulder to see the woman whose name had echoed from Syria to the Nile. They expected fury or despair. What they saw instead was calm. Her golden chains caught the light as she walked. The crowd's noise rose and fell, but she didn't look away. Some said her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if already beyond the city that celebrated her fall. Behind her came the treasures of Palmyra, silk, ivory, and gold carried by slaves. It was meant to humiliate her, to show that all she had built now belonged to Rome. But in that long walk, something shifted. The crowd began to cheer, not for Aurelian, but for her composure. Even in defeat, she looked more like a ruler than a captive. When the parade ended, Aurelian chose not to kill her. He saw no threat left, only a story worth preserving. He gave her a villa near Tivoli. Roman accounts say she lived there for years, raising her children, reading philosophy, and speaking with visitors who came to see the woman who once defied an empire. Some stories claim she even remarried into Roman nobility. Others say she grew old quietly, her power replaced by thought. And still others refuse that ending entirely, saying she took her life before the parade could end, unwilling to let Rome claim her pride. History offers no proof, but whichever ending is true, the meaning remains the same. Zenobia chose how the world would see her. She lost her crown, but not her bearing. She obeyed no script but her own. To the Romans, she was a tale of ambition. To the Syrians, a legend of strength. And to history itself, a reminder that the greatest test of power isn't how it rises, but how it ends. After her fall, the desert went back to its rhythm. Caravans still crossed Palmyra, but fewer stopped. The great halls emptied. The voices that once spoke of empire became whispers in the sand. Rome carried on. Aurelian's name faded into the long line of emperors who came and went. But Zenobia's story did not fade. It lingered, carried by travelers, retold by scholars, reshaped by time. In the East, she became a symbol of pride, the queen who stood for her people when no one else would. In the West, she became a cautionary tale, proof that even brilliance must bow to empire. But across centuries, judgment softened. What remained was respect. Writers called her the last light of the East. Artists painted her as a philosopher queen. Historians compared her to Cleopatra. Though unlike Cleopatra, Zenobia's end came not in tragedy, but in quiet resolve. Her city fell, but her image endured, poised between courage and consequence. Even now, her name stands for something beyond ambition. It stands for leadership that refuses to vanish, even when stripped of its throne. Empires fall, palaces crumble, but character, that quiet discipline that endures through loss, outlasts both. Zenobia proved that power can be taken, but dignity must be surrendered, and she never did. In the long history of rulers who fought for the world, she remains one of the few who truly understood its price. The dust of Palmyra has long since covered her walls, but her story still travels, carried not by armies, but by memory. Because in the end, power fades, stories endure.